of the most prominent individuals this country has produced ever, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. I am in his office. You should see the background. So many titles by him. Thank you, Prof, for being here. I know you have a busy schedule. You've been doing interviews all around, so I really appreciate it. So let's get to it. This is a book. I highly recommend it. It's on the bestsellers, right? As in, I've seen this on the Straits Times bestseller for a while. So I have some questions about this book, but also about your life in general, because it's so fascinating, right? And we were just speaking about the Wall Street Journal review, and which intimated that you said that LKY was a bit jealous of you, right? So how did that come about? Like, because for a Singaporean who hears, is LKY jealous, or was there something? Because you said you spent a lot of time with him. So what was that relationship like?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't I who said it.
Yes, yes.
It was some friends of mine who suggested it, and because they were very puzzled as to why he was so publicly critical of me at two events, you know. But you know, overall, I must emphasize that if you look at the longer history of my relationship with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, clearly for me to be chosen as the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, they had to pick someone who enjoyed his confidence, you know.
Right.
And secondly, I'm one of probably the only person who's handled not one but two projects in the name of Lee Kuan Yew, because I was also the founding chairman of the nominating committee for the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize. Now, both these appointments could only have been made if Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had agreed to them, you know. And other secret that very few people know is that, as you know, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew rarely visits the homes of, you know, citizens of Singapore. I would say that we were very privileged to host Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kuan Yew to dinner in our home once. So I think it's important to take a longer historical view of my relationship with him.
How was that dinner like?
The dinner was absolutely amazing, because what happened was that I had invited Farid Zakaria home for dinner. So I told Farid, who's a friend, so who should I invite? He said, oh, please invite, I think then Minister Mentor. I said, Minister Mentor doesn't go to people's homes for dinner. He said, just try, Kishore, just invite him. So I said, okay. So I wrote a note to the Minister Mentor's office and said, you know, Farid Zakaria says that I should invite you to my house for dinner. He says, okay, I'll come. But of course, you know, I must emphasize that he's been for dinner several times in my house in New York when I was ambassador to the UN. I mean, he does go and have dinner in the house of ambassadors. But for him to have dinner in my house in Singapore, that's very rare. So it was a real privilege to have hosted him in my house.
Okay. So overall, you would describe your relationship with him as in not super close, but mutual respect, or what?
Well, I mean, I would say it varied from phase to phase, different phases, you know.
Okay,
Testing one is a time lag, is it?
Yeah. So you were saying that it's not really a hard knock.
Yeah, I mean,
because nothing happened to you.
I mean, it was to me a very minor episode, you know, in my life. But it's so hard. It's so hard for me to understand why it's such a big deal for so many people. You know, I mean, clearly I made a mistake in writing the article very strongly. But you know,
what was the mistake you think? As in, why do you think it's a mistake?
I mean, the tone I used was very strong. You know, so that's that happens, and you move on. You know, and the big lesson I have for Singaporeans in my book is, you know, don't get beaten down. You know, whenever you have adversity, you know, you got to learn to handle adversity and move on. And you know, I would say that for me, if you look at the last 10 years of my life, they've been glorious.
Right. You mentioned that it's the most productive years of your life.
Absolutely. You know, in the last, since I stepped down as dean, in the last 7 years, I produced 5 books. And one of the books, the Asian 21st Century, the publisher thought I would get 20,000 downloads. Instead, I've had 3.7 million downloads.
Wow. And you mentioned before in an interview, you said most of it not from Singapore, right? It's Malaysia.
In fact, number one downloads in Malaysia, number 2 Singapore, number 3 United States, number 4 Australia, number 5 China.
Yeah, that's so.
So it is a sign that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century.
Okay. So let's get to that. I think it's a good segue, right? So I mean, I know since 1990s, I even assigned one of your articles in my class. Like, you've been consistent about Western hypocrisy. You've always talked about that. As in, so this is not new. Anybody who thinks it's new, as in you've been saying this for decades, right? I guess my question is, and I completely agree with you, everything you say about that. But why would you, or are you not as critical of China? Because don't big powers behave in the way that big powers do?
Well, let me ask you a simple question.
Sure.
Has China invaded Iraq?
Yes. As in, yes, the answer is no. Yes.
So, even Graham Allison, a very famous Harvard professor, who actually, like me, wrote a book on US-China relations. I think I have it up there somewhere. It's called Destined for War. And what he says is that, Americans keep saying, we wish that China could be like us. He says, be careful what you wish for. Because China today, at its current stage of development, as it emerges as a great power, is where the United States was in the 1890s. He says, go back and see what the United States did in the 1890s. When it became powerful, the first thing he did was to flex his muscles, declared war on Spain, conquered Philippines, conquered Guam, conquered territories. And he says, China hasn't done any of that. So, I mean, if you view it objectively, China has been very careful and very restrained as it is emerging as a great power. But I also emphasize that there's no such thing as a benevolent great power. The term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. All great powers will put their interests first. This is a given. This is a lesson I learned after 2 years of Singapore being on the UN Security Council. So you must be very calm, cold, and objective in your analysis. And by the way, when I criticize the United States, I criticize it as a friend, saying there's a better approach for the United States to take. So the approach that I'm recommending for the United States is an approach that Bill Clinton recommended. If you read my book, Has China Won? So I'm not being anti-American. I'm actually suggesting a wiser course for the United States.
One of the questions I received was, is it paradoxical that you always criticize the West, but you also are extremely proud of being published in Foreign Affairs and so on? And I think you just answered that question. You are criticizing the West as a friend, not as somebody who's inherently anti-Western.
I mean, it was Tomiko who says all the time, institutions, individuals and countries languish when they only have unloving critics or uncritical lovers. So I'm a critical lover of the United States of America, and I'm pointing out to the US. And that's why my writings get accepted in the United States. I mean, why would a former president of Harvard, former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers say that my book, Has China Won, is one of the best 3 books he read in the year 2020? He's not going to say an anti-American book is something that one of the best books he read in 2020. He read the book, he understood the message. I'm trying to suggest a wiser course of action for the US.
So, Prof, if I get what you're saying, so you are not denying that China would also have ambitions like US, or maybe not as bad as US, or its maneuverings in the South China Sea and so on, but you're saying that what China has done is nowhere near compared to what US has done in the past 100 years.
I'm also saying what Henry Kissinger says, which is that China behaves differently as a great power than the United States. He says, I mean, if you read Henry Kissinger's book on China, In chapter 1, he says that the Chinese have believed, not for a few hundred years, but a couple of thousand years, that the best way to win a war is to not fight it. And so the avoidance of war is one of the critical strategic maxims of Chinese thought. So the fact that the Chinese are avoiding the fighting of wars is something that's very much in the Chinese character. And this is Henry Kissinger saying this, So whereas the United States, fortunately or unfortunately, especially in the last 20 years, has become trigger happy and has become involved in too many wars. So I, like many Americans, argue that United States should stop fighting wars. And there's an institute called the Quincy Institute that is supported by both the left and the right in the American body politic that is arguing for restraint in American foreign policy. So as a friend of the United States, I support the call for restraint.
So you would similarly be critical of China's maneuvering in the South China Sea or so on?
I have been critical.
Yeah. As in,
I mean, if you read my books, you see that I point out very early on, I think in 2008, in my book, The New Asian Hemisphere, that the 9-dash line that China has created, number one, has no basis in international law. It goes against the UN Law of the Sea Convention, as Tomiko has pointed out. And it is also against China's national interests.
Right.
Because China is now a global maritime power. Right. It is not in China's interest to see countries gobble up bodies of water as national territories. Right. And so, I have been, if people who read my writings carefully can see those criticisms.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's a question. Okay. So, should we be comparing behaviors from a couple of hundred years ago with states today, especially since we have an international order today?
Well, I can tell you that my answer to the listener or viewer is the laws of geopolitics have been around for 2,000 years. And what the United States is doing in trying to thwart the rise of China, it is responding to an impulse that's 2,000 years old. So for us to think that geopolitics just began today is a major misunderstanding of human history. And you got to compare apples with apples. And there's a certain pattern of rising powers and how they behave. And actually, again, if you read Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, he points out how there have been dozens of instances going back centuries on how great powers thwart the rise of competing great powers. So to in fact, I would say to not go into history would be hugely irresponsible if you want to understand the world of tomorrow.
Right. So I agree with that statement. I'm intrigued by what you say because George Yeo has a similar idea about civilizational, cultural consciousness, and that factors in a lot for you in terms of predicting how China would behave.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to look at each country, each society, each civilization understands its history, its impulses, and so on and so forth.
And you would say the realpolitik could be circumscribed by the country's civilizational consciousness.
No, realpolitik is there all the time. So China will behave also as a great power, no question whatsoever. But also how China behaves will also, when it emerges as a great power, will also depend on how you treat it as it is emerging as a great power. So to put it very simply, when a dragon, as Napoleon said, when the dragon is asleep, let the dragon sleep. Don't wake it up, because when it wakes up, it will stir the world. And we know that the dragon is waking up, and it's better for us to have the dragon wake up peacefully rather than to make it angry. And so I actually think America is going against its own national interests in trying to thwart the rise of China. You can actually find ways and means of working with China. And certainly from the point of view of humanity at large, all of us who live outside United States and China, we should all tell United States and China that our planet is facing more immediate pressing challenges like climate change, which is going to ruin our lives in over the next 20, 30 years. So why argue about who has the bigger cabin on the boat if the boat is sinking? So let's fix the sinking boat first. So this is what we in the rest of humanity should be telling both US and China. So as friends of both of them, we should say, press the pause button on this contest.
So your position on this is quite clear, right? Do you think it's in line with our government's positions on the US, China?
Well, I must emphasize, I never speak for the Singapore government.
I understand, but do you?
I think it would be hugely unfair to the Singapore government. So the Singapore government has made its position very, very clear. Our former Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, both in his speech in Shangri-La Dialogue and an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs, has said clearly that Singapore will not take sides in the US-China contest, and that position is crystal clear.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So related to this, yes, there's another question. Yes, please. Okay. So do you think US is today an imperialist power?
I think all great powers are imperialists in one way or another. And certainly the United States has 800 military bases around the world. We have never had any great power in human history that has had 800 bases in all corners of the world. And I think actually, as a friend of the United States, it's unwise for the United States to spend so much on military defense at a time when the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% hasn't gone up for decades.
Right.
So it should be focusing its attention on its domestic needs and priorities. Yeah.
Part of the rise of populists. That's precisely what they say, right? Like, why are you spending so much? Thank you for that.
That's one of the few sensible things that Donald Trump says, which is that why is America spending money fighting wars overseas when it should be taking care of its people?
That's true. Even though he's not fully consistent on it, but that principle, he's absolutely right on that, right? Yeah.
Donald Trump is not consistent on anything.
I won't disagree with
that. Consistency of Donald Trump is an
but I won't disagree with that. But you would see that now being anti-China is bipartisan, right? Even the Democrats are.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's definitely anti-China.
Yeah.
But that all Americans are.
Yeah. So the Democrats are.
Virtually all Americans are.
Right.
There are actually some sensible Americans who think that there should be a wiser course of action. And, Foreign Affairs published an article by an American professor, Jessica Chen Weiss, arguing that America should change its behavior towards China.
Okay. Thank you. And now related to that, and also one of the current issues of our time, I would say, perhaps the issue of our time, I feel that Palestine has really exposed a lot of what you have said before about the hypocrisy of America in terms of upholding international institutions and so on. If you were the PERMSEC, but I mean that's well established, and my worry is that it's very hard for international institutions to recover from this after this. But if you were advising, and that's in Singapore's disadvantage, right? If people do not respect international institutions, so if you were advising, you were still the PERMSEC of MFA, right? What would you advise the Singapore government on what should be the stand we take on this? Or do you think they are doing a pretty good job so far?
Well, number one, I would say our government is doing a pretty good job so far. But I would say we take our stand on these matters on matters of principle, very clear. In fact, as you know, there was just a resolution on Israel and Palestine that Singapore voted in favor of, and I think that's the correct position for Singapore to take. But at the same time, I think we should also realize that this is not an issue that should be number one for Singapore. At the end of the day, what happens in our neighborhood is much more important, and we should certainly spend most of our resources to make sure that our region, Southeast Asia, remains peaceful. That, I think, should be our priority.
Right. Yeah. I guess because for a lot of young people, this is the first time we are seeing, or they are seeing, we are seeing this like blatant injustice in our face, so it's a bit difficult to ignore it. Even though I agree with you that probably because you have mentioned before the US-China tension that is far more consequential to Singapore, right? But just as a point of morality or moral consciousness, this is something that people cannot easily ignore, right?
Yeah, but in foreign policy, you got to look at morality, and you got to look at also your hard-headed long-term interests in various issues. So you got to balance all these things.
Okay. Correct. So what about recognition of Palestine as a state? Do you think that's on the immediate horizon?
Well, I think clearly the trend line is that more and more countries are recognizing Palestine as a state, and many countries are doing so as a way of signaling to Israel that it should work harder for a two-state solution. And I think it's very unwise for Israel not to work for a two-state solution, because in the long run, that's the only answer. You know, there are the people of Palestine; they deserve a state of their own, and they should be allowed to develop a state of their own in the West Bank and in the Gaza.
So you would be supportive of recognizing Palestine?
I mean, again, I would be supportive personally, but whether or not the Singapore government should do it is
understand.
a decision of the Singapore government.
Right. No, thank you. I appreciate your
I must emphasize I'm no longer with the government.
I mean, but I'm sure the government does. I mean, pay attention to your thoughts, right? With your experience and so on. So your words do carry some weight, right? And in that,
I see. I'm not privy to the Singapore government knows much more than I do.
Right? Of course,
they are aware of all kinds of other pressures and other considerations that I'm not aware of.
Right.
So I don't want to pass judgment on what the Singapore government does because they have access to much more information and knowledge than I do.
Right. Yeah. So just now you mentioned about it's always important for us to be principled, but as a small state, I mean, of course, the government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would say that we always go by principles. But you also mentioned before in an interview where there was a decision which you supported in principle, but felt that Singapore shouldn't do it, or Lee Kuan Yew or Goh Chok Tong told you that shouldn't. Oh, sorry, Rajaratnam told you. Mahathir was saying Antarctica belongs to the world.
That's right.
And
I agree with Mahathir.
So,
I agree with Mahathir that Antarctica should not be seized by the most powerful countries in the world. Just as you know, one of the results of the Law of the Sea Convention, it says that what's at high seas is the common heritage of humanity. So similarly, Antarctica should be the common heritage of humanity and not be seized by the great powers of the day. So Mahathir was absolutely right. I wanted to support him, but Mr. Rajaratnam told me, Kishore, shut up. So I shut up.
So principles not always to be acted on.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm sure the Singapore government's got other considerations. At the time, we were certainly courting the Western countries to invest in Singapore, to work with Singapore. So you got to choose our fights carefully.
Right.
So it's very wise of the Singapore government to choose not to fight the Western countries.
So when is that? When do principles take a back seat to hard-nosed material security interests?
Well, unfortunately, see, the reality about life is that if you expect a simple black and white answer, you get into deep trouble. You got to understand that all these things are very complex and often contextual. You got to look at the time. What's the most pressing thing that you have to worry about, and what is more immediate, something you got to solve, what is something you can push to the back burner, and so on and so forth. These are all the considerations. So it's never the case that, you must always put principle first, or you must always put realpolitik first.
Right.
You got to balance these things depending on the context and the circumstances. And that was what many Singaporeans don't understand, that Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam were geopolitical geniuses of the highest order. And you can see from the photographs, I met so many world leaders around the world. And having met so many world leaders, I now realize that Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee and Rajaratnam were more brilliant than most world leaders. And that's something that's an amazing accident of history of Singapore that we don't appreciate enough. And which is why I published this book.
Why is that? Why don't we I mean, Singaporeans are very familiar with the genius of Lee Kuan Yew, but not so much others of that generation. Right?
Yeah, I think, well, I think the lack of ignorance, the ignorance of Singapore's history is quite frightening, which is why, as you know, which is why I wrote an article saying that Singapore should have a history prize, and fortunately, anonymous donors stepped up and donated $500,000 to NUS for the history prize. So certainly, I think my goal with these memoirs is to hopefully spark a greater interest among young Singaporeans of their own very special history.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yeah. So since our neighbors are mostly Muslim, so would actually moving the needle on Palestine be in our geopolitical interest? Actually, we can look at it and see that this is actually quite pragmatic for us.
Yeah. No, well, I think certainly we pay attention to what our neighbors' views are, but I think our neighbors also understand that Singapore has an independent and sovereign foreign policy. As you can see in my memoirs, our neighbors, all our three neighbors, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, protested when the president of Israel visited Singapore. And if you read my memoirs, when the ambassador of Palestine in Kuala Lumpur criticized Singapore, I managed to get an apology from Yasser Arafat for that criticism of Singapore. So I think our neighbors understand that each country will have to decide its own foreign policy on the basis of its own interests.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. So,
and I can also tell you a secret.
Please.
That some of our neighbors also talking secretly to Israel.
Oh yeah, of course. That is true. Yeah. Do you want to name names or not? Right.
I have a sense that Walid wants to get me into trouble. All these questions are trying to push me into saying things I shouldn't say. He's a very what did I say? Nakal Sali.
But thank you for that, because I think, would you say that there's a lack of foreign policy literacy even when we discuss politics in Singapore? We discuss domestic politics more than.
Well, I think, unfortunately, that's true in most countries in the world.
Okay.
I mean,
so it's not just Singapore.
Even in the United States, in Europe, and I mean, the Europe as a continent is totally lost.
Right.
In this world, and it's amazing. They have some of the most sophisticated universities, think tanks, but there's virtually no long-term strategic thinking in Europe. So let's not criticize ourselves too much. Overall, ASEAN is doing much better than the European Union is.
Fair enough. So now if we could turn towards domestic issues more, right? So as a senior statesman, what would your advice to the 4G be, especially after the last election and the upcoming elections, but looking beyond elections as well? If you could advise Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, what would be the top 2 or 3 pieces of advice you have for him?
Well, I think I would say that Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is very much aware of what Singapore's needs and challenges are. And one of them clearly is to engage the younger people of Singapore and give them a sense of hope in the future. And this is where I think he's been remarkably successful with his communication skills,
The National Day rally?
Yes. And I don't know whether I have said this publicly before, but during the height of the COVID crisis, Lawrence Wong was our chief communicator to the public. He was so good at it that the founder of TED Talks, I've given a TED Talk which has had over 2 million views. The founder of TED Talks called me from the United States and said, Kishore, I've been watching this young man, Lawrence Wong. He's been explaining the COVID situation so well. Can you please ask him to come and give a TED Talk on how to manage COVID? The founder of TED Talks, which is amazing. By the way, it's very hard to get a slot on TED Talks,
right?
But to be invited is very rare. And
what happened
and then so I immediately conveyed that offer to the office of then Minister Lawrence Wong. But then he replied to me, he said, Kishore, we have other priorities now. We have to take care of COVID. So he turned down the offer. But the key point here is that if the founder of TED Talks thinks that he's a brilliant communicator, it shows that he's a brilliant communicator not just by Singapore standards, but by global standards.
Okay. So he should give younger people hope, and I think you think he has done that already.
Yes, he's doing it. Yeah.
What about
By the way, nothing changes overnight. I mean, he's been prime minister only a few months, so give him time.
Right.
As they say, Rome wasn't built overnight.
Yes. So foreign policy usually, because there's all sorts of the secrecy. So a lot of times the rationale is not 100% given, or so. But how do people buy in if there are gaps in the information? How do you get people to?
It all depends on how much trust the people have in the government. You know, at the end of the day, there's no way the government can share publicly all the information that it has. And I know because, you know, when I was permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I was aware of many secretive things happening. And of course, I have a legal obligation not to reveal that, ever. And so in the same way, I know that the Singapore government has a lot more information. And so what the public needs to do is to indicate whether it trusts the government. And I think there's a very high level of trust in the Singapore government's ability to manage these challenges.
Right. Okay. Fine enough. Yeah. So this is an interesting one, right? So the UN vote on occupation, right? So how does it look for Singapore practically? Since Singapore voted for that.
Well, I can tell you that Singapore complies with international law. And the only UN resolutions that are mandatory and binding are resolutions that are adopted by the UN Security Council. The resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly are essentially like recommendations and not mandatory and binding. So I think it's unlikely that the United States would allow any Security Council resolution that imposes sanctions on Israel. So the question of sanction on Israel will never arise.
Right. Because of the legality of it. Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is interesting. So because the conventional wisdom, and I think for the most part historically it's been true, right, that having that deep ties with Israel is beneficial to Singapore. But if the public opinion of the world is turning, as evidence from many surveys, right? Where do you think is the tipping point between for Singapore as a state? Like,
well, I think it's important for Singapore to take a long-term perspective. And you know, when you have relations with countries, you must always expect ups and downs, and there will be periods when you'll disagree with the country. So, for example, Singapore expelled an American diplomat sometimes. But does that mean we cut off our ties to the United States? We don't. And actually, the whole reason why diplomacy was invented not to enable you to talk to your friends. Because when you go and talk to your friends, they don't chop your head off. Diplomacy was invented to enable you to talk to enemies and to countries that you disagree with, because they chop off your head if you go to an enemy court. So if we have differences with Israel, and we do have some differences with Israel, the answer is not to break off diplomatic relations. The answer is to continue talking to them. And I think in private, we have been quite candid in our messages to Israel to say it's in your long-term interest to work for a two-state solution. And don't forget that at the end of the day, if a small state like Singapore cuts off ties to Israel, it will have zero impact. Especially when the big countries like China and India, who also disagree with Israel's policies, still maintain their relations with Israel. So I think this is where Singaporeans got to learn to be very sophisticated and nuanced in arriving at judgments, and don't expect simple black and white answers.
Does China benefit the most from this? The US credibility going down the drain, especially in the global south. Does that mean these countries will go to China now, or they were already moving that? Will this hasten the move towards seeing China as the ultimate superpower or ultimate patron, I suppose?
No, but I think you also got to understand that the countries of global south are not going to give up their ties with the United States also. So even our neighbors, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, even though they are very critical of Israel's policies on Palestine, they still maintain their good ties with the United States.
Right.
And you don't forget, United States has invested more in ASEAN than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. So American investment is still very critical for Southeast Asia.
Right.
So we have to factor in all these things, and I don't think you can say that because of one issue the United States will lose its position in the region.
Fair enough. So yes, please. Is there ever, because we have never done that, right? We've never cut off ties with South Africa or Iran, North Korea. So
I don't think we had relations with South Africa during apartheid.
Right. So
I may be wrong, but you can please double check.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
But I think the biggest mistake when you have difficulties with countries is to break off diplomatic relations. So, for example, as a friend of the United States, I've told Americans that the ABC of diplomacy is that diplomacy was created to enable you to talk to your enemies. And since the United States says that North Korea is an enemy, since the United States says Iran is an enemy, now sometimes it says Cuba is an enemy, the first thing you do is that once a country becomes an enemy, you should establish diplomatic relations. So the United States is doing something very mistaken when it sort of overturns the whole thing by saying that before I can establish diplomatic relations with you, you must be a friend. Now that's wrong.
Right.
Diplomacy was not invented to enable you to talk to your friends. Diplomacy was invented to enable you. So I don't understand why more countries are not trying to persuade the United States that the minute any country becomes your enemy, the first thing you should do is establish diplomatic relations. That's why diplomacy was invented.
I think Pritam Singh actually agreed with Minister Vivian on this, on this exact point that you were mentioning. Yes. Right. So international institutions, if they are disrespected, then how does it affect Singapore as a small country whose existence is
well,
dependent?
I think I must emphasize that while the United States has policy, I wrote an entire book called The Great Convergence on Global Governance, in which I explain why it was unwise for the United States to undermine the United Nations. But I must emphasize that in this regard, United States is the exception. Virtually every other country in the world believes that the UN should be strengthened. Actually, I think there are two countries that want to weaken the UN. One is United States, the other is Israel. And I can understand why Israel wants to do so, because Israel is always criticized by the United Nations. So, but what the United States and Israel do vis-a-vis the UN is not what all the rest of the world believes in. And even the European Union countries are not trying to withdraw from the UN. I mean, they will be better friends of the United States if they could advise the United States to stop undermining the UN. Because in the long run, the United States is shooting itself in the foot by undermining the UN. Because, as Bill Clinton said, if the United States is going to be number one forever, then fine, you can keep on doing what you're going to do. But if you can conceive of a world in which the United States is number two, then it's the United States' interest to strengthen multilateral institutions. So this is where, again, we should therefore, the rest of the world should speak more frankly to the United States. That's the only country that is trying to, in one way or another, undermine the UN.
Okay, thank you. Right. So what is ASEAN's secret? You think, is there such a thing? That we have relative religious racial harmony?
Well, I can tell you, I'm sorry to say this, my apologies, but I did write a book called ASEAN Miracle. And but I'm really happy with that question, because Singaporeans don't understand that ASEAN is a huge geopolitical gift to Singapore. Huge. I mean, ASEAN is a geopolitical buffer for Singapore against all these great powers putting pressure on the region. So we in Singapore should worship and cherish ASEAN. And I don't understand why Singaporeans don't do so. And by the way, there's no other regional organization that handles diversity as well as ASEAN. Because no other region of the world has 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, communists. We have everything in Southeast Asia. And yet we are one of the most peaceful regions in planet Earth. It's a miracle. And I feel very sad that Singaporeans don't worship this miracle.
No, I feel the same way, and it's very interesting. When I interviewed Prof. Tomiko, George Yeo, all of them say the same thing. But when you talk to ordinary Singaporeans, they don't care about ASEAN. Not only they don't care, they look down on other ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
Why this disconnect if it's so important to us geopolitically? But
so I think we need to change the curriculum in our schools. And I think we need to make knowledge and understanding of ASEAN compulsory for young Singaporeans, so they have an understand why ASEAN is special.
Okay, fair enough. Oh, final question from the audience. From the audience. Okay, good question. So, one policy that you would introduce or you wouldn't have implemented that the government did?
Well, I mean, they're both related. I have argued in an article in Straits Times that Singapore should aspire to be a zero car ownership society.
I saw that.
We are a small enough island. We are so tiny. We don't have to own cars. Now we are entering an era of self-driving cars. Self-driving cars will come to your house, pick you up, drop you off, and you don't have to own a car, right? So we actually should be the first society. I mean, by the way, people want to own cars and keep it in their garages and show off that they own a Lamborghini, go ahead. But you don't need a Lamborghini to go at 30 kilometers an hour down Frankel Avenue, to take you somewhere. It makes no economic sense at all. So we can be the first society. And at the same time, in terms of policies that I would do differently, we have spent so much money building highways and roads to make car travel easy. Frankly, we should now create more space for pedestrians, cyclists, and self-driving cars so that you can actually reduce the amount of space given for roads in Singapore, and that will create more green space in Singapore.
That's a huge fundamental shift, not just infrastructure-wise, but mentality-wise. I can imagine a lot of elites would be the ones who are opposing.
Unfortunately for Singapore, a car is a status symbol.
100%.
In theory, 100%. The car is supposed to be a utility, like a refrigerator. You need a refrigerator to keep your food cold. So if the utility of the car is to give you mobility, and if you can get the same mobility without owning a car, why own a car? So I think that should be our aspiration. But it cannot be done overnight. It will take at least 10 to 20 years to do it. But we can at least start the process of creating a blueprint for zero car ownership Singapore. By the way, young people get very inspired when you give them a vision or a dream.
Agreed.
That is something that say, okay, I'm leading a more meaningful life.
Right. Beyond the material. Yes, 100%. Final.
I cannot say that I have oratorical skills. But I must say I've learned a lot from watching some of our leaders, especially Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So I learned some important rules from Lee Kuan Yew. Rule number 1, when you step up on the stage, the first thing you must do is win over the audience immediately. Very critical. If you lose the audience at the beginning, you lost them for the whole.
You mean the first few minutes of
first few minutes is very critical. And secondly, don't use unnecessary words. Don't use fluff. So use the minimum number of words to put across your point. And number 3, please have something substantive to say. If you have nothing substantive to say, don't speak.
There's a saying, right? Politicians sometimes they have nothing to say, but they say it so well. So you're saying avoid that, right? Okay. So final thing that you would say that if I were to, you are very healthy, you live a very long life. What is the thing that you want people to take away from, 50 years from now when we remember Kishore Mahbubani? How do you want to be remembered?
Well, I can say number 1, I'm not very healthy because I did have a bypass operation. I think what I want to be remembered for is that I made Asians aware that the 21st century is the Asian century. And I must emphasize that up to now, no American leader dares to use the word Asian century. No European leader dares to use the word Asian century. So if the word Asian century becomes of household use 50 years from now, it would show that perhaps I made a small contribution.
Very interesting that you chose the global one instead of your lifetime of public service to Singapore. But, so you are beyond our shows.
It takes a lifetime of public service before you can write 10 books.
Right. And you don't think it would have been possible
if I hadn't worked for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and Mr. Rajaratnam, I would not have written 10 books.
Prof, thank you so much, not just for this interview, for everything as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.